Real estate investment practice problem using Onenote. Refinance calculation. Get ready because we're raising the stakes with real estate. Here we are in Onenote. If you have access to Onenote, would like to follow along, you're not required to, but if would like to, we're in the icon left-hand side, Practice Problems tab, down in the 6071 Refinance tab. Also note, when using Onenote, take a look at the Immersive Reader tool, presentations, also in the text area, same name, same number, but with transcripts that can be translated into multiple different languages and either listened to or read in them. Closing the icon, we got the information up top, calculations on down, looking at the refinance scenario, original loan on the left, the opportunity to refinance on the right. Remember, the general idea of the refinance would be that you have some loan that you have outstanding. We're going to say here it's going to be a standard 30-year fixed type of loan, but that doesn't have to be the only circumstance that it could be. And then we're imagining that we want to refinance. One of the common reasons to refinance, especially if you have the fixed rate loan, is that the rate goes down. So if the rate goes down, we might have an opportunity to then take advantage of that lower rate. So just remember kind of the pros and cons between a fixed rate and adjustable rate loan as you think about these kind of refinancing options. If you have the fixed rate loan, which is kind of the standard, it's going to give you less risk in the event that rates go up. So if rates go up and you locked in or fixed the rate, then you're doing good with regards to your loan typically, because then you're going to be keeping the payment as what it is, even though the market rates are going up, and you're going to be basically paying off the loan with the same dollar amounts which are now worth less due to inflation, because rates going up possibly in part to inflation. Now, if you have the fixed rate loan and the rate goes down, then you don't have that automatic adjustment as you would with the adjustable rates. The adjustable loan would actually be better in that event, although, again, you don't know what's going to happen in the future, so there's risk as to whether the rates are going to go up or down. But the fixed rate will not adjust automatically when it goes down, and now you've got a higher rate than the market rate. And you're saying, well, hey, I want to take advantage of the lower rate. I want my rate as low as possible. So at that point, you have the option to refinance. When we're refinancing, then the question is, is the refinance going to be beneficial based on the fees that you're going to have to do in order to go through the refinancing process? And that's the general idea that we will have. So let's look at it in detail here. We've got on the left-hand side our starting loan point. We're going to say it's a $120,000 loan. And that's basically our starting point. We put it up here in the home value with nothing down, but we're really just kind of starting at the $120,000 loan. We're going to say we started off with a 30-year fixed loan, 360 payments, which is 12 times 30. The rate was starting at 7% at the rate. Payment calculation based on that information up top using the PMT function in Excel, 798.36. Total payments, $287,411. Total interest, $167,411 based on that information. We're going to imagine rates 15 years later have gone down from 7% to 6%. That's a whole percent down. So we're saying, maybe it would be worthwhile to refinance given that change. So we're going to look into the refinancing. In order to do that, we would then have to see, well, what's my loan balance 15 years later? Now, if you're projecting this out, you can do a calculation for it. We'll take a look at it in more detail, or the amortization table would tell you. Obviously, if you were at that point in time in history, you would know what your loan balance is at that point in time. You can look at your bill and see what the balance is. And we're saying it's going to be $88,823, which we'll get into more detail later. So now we're going to say 15 years later, 15 years have passed. We want to take and look into refinancing at the $88,823, the remaining loan balance, just simply for the remainder of the term, 15 years. In other words, we're not looking into another 30 years out. 15 years have already passed. We'd still like to pay off the home within the 15 years, 15 times. Then the 12 would be payments or months of 180. The rate went down. Market rate's now at the 6%. However, we're going to have to pay for the fees. So we got to estimate what the fees are. We're going to assume that they're going to be $2,500. Those fees paid up front in the refinance generally. So then we can kind of calculate the effective rate. We'll take a look at that in more detail. And then we've got the payment calculation at the 749.54. So then, of course, the question is, well, is this a good idea or not? There's a couple different ways you can look at it. You could say, well, I'm getting the lower rate. That's obviously good. We got the lower payments that are going to be taking place. That's obviously good. But we had to put the $2,500 down up front. So you can kind of think of it as an investment in that situation, right? You're putting $2,500 down up front, and you're getting back the reduction in the payment, the difference between the two payments over time, over the next 15 years, over the next 180 months worth of payments. So one calculation you could do is you could say, well, I could try to do that effective rate type of calculation. I could say, well, if I try to roll in this cost into a percent and then be able to compare that percent, that's one calculation we can do to see if it would be worthwhile. We could say this equals the rate calculation. Then we're going to take the number of the number of periods, which would be 15 times 12 or 180, comma, the payment, which I'm going to make negative so it comes out properly. The payment would then be the 749.54, and then comma, the present value then not being simply the loan amount, but the loan amount minus the 2,500. That then, in essence, rolling in the costs into a percentage calculation, and we get to the 6.45, kind of like an APR calculation. And you can see that's still lower than the 7%. So we're thinking, maybe it would be worthwhile then if we did this over the whole 30-year time period. But we also might be saying, hey, I can put that 2,500 somewhere else as well. Could I get a return that would be higher than the benefit I'm getting here? And we could think of it as a rate of return type of calculation, which we'll look at shortly. Now, if we were to map out these two amortization tables, the first one, we started at the 120 30-year loan, and we had the payments, which calculated up top, the rate then using the 7% to calculate out. It would then be fully amortized after the 30 years. The second one, we're imagining the opportunity after 15 years had passed from this loan to start the new loan for the loan balance after 15 years, which in this case, if I go down this amortization table for 15 years right there, that 88,823, that's where we would be standing in our imagined time frame, 15 years from the first loan. That's when our story starts in terms of whether or not we're going to refinance. So that would be our balance 15 years later, the 88,823, and then we have the new payment amount that we calculated at the 749.54, 750 about the interest calculated using the rate of the 6%. This one then being fully amortized after 15 years, then it would be fully amortized. Remember, this is the second half or the second 15 years. So we could stop this loan, basically pay off this loan with the new loan and do the second half, or we can stay with the first loan and continue on with the second 15 years, and it would be fully amortized at the end of that process. So those are kind of the scenarios. Now, another calculation that we might do, we might say, okay, well, what's kind of like my payback period? How long would it take before I basically make back my 2,500, or in essence, kind of like the break-even point without taking into consideration like time value of money calculations? So we could say, for example, if my payments are going from 798.36, that's not a 7. There's going from 798.36 minus the 749.54 means we're saving 48.82 a month. So if I took 48.82 a month and I take my 2,500 divided by 48.82, then I can say that it would take me 52 time periods in order to make back the money. In other words, if I divide that by 12, we're looking around 4.25 years, 4 years and a quarter, in order to basically make back the 2,500 I'm putting down up front by savings between the difference in the two payments. So that's one way we could look at it when we're going to get paid back. Another way to think about it is an ROI type of calculation, your rate of return. So we could be saying, hey, I could either use my opportunity cost kind of thought process and say, well, I could take that 2,500, invest it in essence here with the refinance process and save that money in the savings, or I could invest it somewhere else. So what would be my rate of return if I was in essence going to take that 2,500 and invest it here? There's a couple ways we could do that. We could do that this way, and then we'll do it with an IRR type of calculation. So we could use a rate calculation to calculate this. That would be the rate, and then brackets, the number of periods. The number of periods would be the 15 times the 12 or the 180, and then negative of this period minus the payments. Now the payments, I'm looking at the difference between the two. The difference between these two payments, subtracting that out, which we calculated, what was it again? 798.36 minus the 749.54, 48.82, and then comma, the present value then being the 2,500, and then that would give us the monthly amount. So we close it up and multiply the entire thing times 12 to get the yearly amount, and then we got an ROI of the 22.62. So the 22.62, we can also think of that using an IRR type of calculation, which sometimes is a little bit easier to think about, meaning we represent our cash flows. So you can think about it as an outflow upfront of the 2,500 that we're paying upfront, and then an inflow or savings of the difference between the two payments, which was that 48.82, about 49. This is rounded. And so then if we take that all the way down using our Excel function, we can get the total here. We could sum up the total cash flow, and we can calculate the IRR of those flows. The rate at which that series of cash flows would be 0 is the 22.62 once again. So sometimes that representing this information as kind of like a cash flow would give you a better idea oftentimes. And now the next scenario we can look at, we could say, okay, well, what if we were going to sell the property, say, in 7 years? So now we've got a refinance of 15. We're going to refinance it for 15 years, but we plan on selling it in 7 years. So now we got the added wrinkle happening here. So to do that, we need to know what the loan balances are at the end of the time frames. So for the first one, we can say the original loan would have been 15 plus 7, would have been 15 plus 7, or 22 years out. So if I go up to my amortization table, we're looking 22 years out. We would still have a loan balance if we didn't refinance of right here, that's going to be the 58,558. So that's going to be the 58,558. And if we did refinance, so 15 years had passed, then we refinance, then we pass 7 years, which would be right here. 57, we would still owe after that 7 years, 57,036. So now we're going to put that here. That's the 57,036. And the difference between those two then, the balance we would still have at the end then, would be the 1,521.89. Now this one gets a little bit complicated to calculate the rate calculation on it now, but in essence we're adding kind of like a future value calculation on it. So again, the IRR, the cash flow, is often a useful tool to kind of think about it in a bit more depth. If you could do both, you can feel like you're kind of double checking yourself a bit. So we got the rate, we got the number of periods. The number of periods would now be 7 times 12 to get the monthly amount. The payment once again is going to be that 48 something, the difference between these two payments. And then we're going to say comma, the present value. The present value is going to be the 2,500 fee that we had, and then comma, we have the future value, and the future value is now going to be that difference that we just calculated between the ending balance of the two loans of the 1,521.89. Closing that up, that would give us the monthly amount. We want the yearly amount. Therefore, we're going to multiply that times 12, and that gives us our 20.936. So you can see it's a little bit lower than if we were to hold it to the maturity for the second 15 years. You may also then calculate that using our IRR calculation, the top of it looking much the same. We'd say, okay, well, now I got my outflow of the 1,500 500, and then we got our 49s all the way down. But then at the end, on 84 here, we're going to have to pay off the 49 plus the ending balance, which we're going to say is the difference. We're looking at the differences between the two loans. So we got that 1.5. We've got the difference between these two, which is the 49, and then we've got this 1521, so the 1521.89 plus the 49 about would give us about then that 1571 about. So the total flow would be the 3,123, and there, once again, if we calculate our IRR using the IRR function, would give us the 20.936. So the 20.936 that we see here. So those are a couple tools that you can look at with the refinance. So once again, if you have a fixed rate, the rate goes up, then good job on the fixed rate. You locked it in. You made a good move. If the rate goes down, then you still were avoiding risk by taking the fixed rate. So I still think that's good. And you have the opportunity to refinance, thinking about whether it would be worth refinancing at that point in time. And then taking into consideration the fees that would be involved. You can calculate the payback period. You can calculate the effective rate and try to compare that to your prior rate. And you could do a rate of return type of calculation as well to kind of to think a little bit more in depth as to whether or not it'd be a good decision to put your money there or elsewhere.